Members of the jury. Our first suspect has stood under investigation for nearly 17 centuries. Its name is Jebel Musa, the Mountain of Moses. Located in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, Jebel Musa rises approximately 7,500 feet above sea level and has become the mountain most people associate with the biblical Mount Sinai. Millions of pilgrims have traveled here. Monasteries have been built here. Churches have defended it. Tour guides proclaim it. Maps have even labeled it. Books have printed it. For many Christians around the world, this mountain is Mount Sinai. Case closed. Or is it? Today we will examine the evidence. Not tradition, not popularity, but evidence. The prosecution now calls suspect number 1 to the stand. For centuries, believers have gazed upon these rugged granite peaks and wondered, could this truly be the mountain where Moses met God? The mountain where the 10 Commandments were given? The mountain where heaven touched earth? To answer those questions, we must first ask another question. How did this mountain become associated with Sinai in the first place? Because surprisingly, the Bible never names Jebel Musa. Not once. In fact, the identification of Jebel Musa as Mount Sinai appears long after the events of the Exodus, more than 1,000 years later. To understand why, we must travel back to the 4th century. The Roman Empire had changed dramatically. Christianity, once persecuted, was now becoming the dominant faith of the empire. At the center of this transformation stood Emperor Constantine the Great. Constantine's conversion to Christianity changed the course of history. But another figure would play a major role in identifying many of Christianity's holy sites. His mother, Helena, known to history as Saint Helena. Around 326 AD, Helena traveled to the Holy Land. According to historical accounts, she sought to identify important locations connected to biblical events. She is traditionally credited with identifying the site of Jesus' crucifixion and burial. Churches were built, pilgrimages increased, and sacred geography began taking shape. During this period, Christian monks and pilgrims also began associating certain locations in the Sinai Peninsula with the Exodus story. Eventually, the mountain now known as Jebel Musa became linked to Mount Sinai. But Helena herself never left behind a detailed report identifying Jebel Musa as Sinai. Instead, the tradition developed gradually among Christian communities in the centuries following Constantine. By the 4th and 5th centuries, many Christians had accepted the mountain as the biblical site, and that tradition has endured ever since. But is ancient tradition evidence? Or is it merely ancient tradition? That question remains before the court. And one of the strongest arguments for Jebel Musa is not archaeology, it's continuity, the uninterrupted history of pilgrimage. For over 1,500 years, believers have traveled to this mountain, generation after generation, century after century. The memory never disappeared. The location was never forgotten. Now, unlike many biblical sites that vanished into obscurity, Jebel Musa remained a destination for pilgrims throughout the Byzantine era, the Middle Ages, and into modern times. Supporters argue that such a long-standing tradition should not be dismissed lightly. Could an entire region have preserved the memory of Sinai's location? Some scholars believe so. After all, Local traditions sometimes preserve historical truths long after written records disappear. This continuity forms one of the strongest pieces of evidence presented by advocates of Jebel Musa. At the foot of the mountain sits one of Christianity's oldest functioning monasteries, St. Catherine's Monastery, built during the reign of an emperor in the 6th century. This remarkable monastery has survived wars, empires, invasions, and centuries of political change. Inside some of the oldest Christian manuscripts in existence, ancient icons, rare biblical texts, and centuries of testimony connecting this mountain to Sinai. The monastery itself was not built randomly. Its builders believed that they were preserving sacred ground. In fact, the monastery was constructed near a site traditionally identified as the burning bush, the very bush where God spoke to Moses. Today, visitors can still view a bush claimed by tradition to descend from that original plant. Whether that claim can be verified is another matter, but the tradition remains, and traditions often shape history. Supporters of Jebel Musa also point to geography, specifically the large plain known as Araha, located at the base of the mountain. According to Exodus, a large number of Israelites camped before Mount Sinai. The text describes an entire nation gathered at the foot of a mountain. Advocates argue that Araha provides one of the few sizable gathering areas in the region capable of accommodating a large encampment. Standing in this valley today, one can easily imagine thousands gathered below while Moses ascended the mountain above. Critics debate whether the space is large enough for the biblical numbers. Yet supporters maintain that it remains a significant geographical feature consistent with the biblical account. Another point frequently raised involves the summit itself. Jebel Musa possesses dramatic peaks and natural formations that create an imposing, awe-inspiring setting. Exodus describes thunder, lightning, fire, smoke, a trumpet blast, and a mountain trembling in the presence of God. Supporters argue that the mountain's dramatic appearance fits the grandeur of the biblical narrative. While beauty alone cannot identify Sinai, many pilgrims throughout history have found the mountain's appearance remarkably fitting. There's also a matter of accessibility. Jebel Musa sits within Sinai Peninsula, a region traditionally associated with Israel's wilderness wanderings. For centuries, scholars assumed the Exodus route passed through this area. If that assumption is correct, then locating Sinai within the peninsula appears very reasonable. Many biblical maps throughout history reflect this understanding. Consequently, Jebel Musa became the natural candidate, the traditional candidate, the expected candidate. But every case requires cross-examination, and every piece of evidence deserves scrutiny. When investigators examine Jebel Musa, they encounter several challenges. The first is archaeology. There is no known historical source from the time of Moses identifying this mountain. None from Joshua, none from Judges, none from David, none from Solomon, none from the prophets. The identification appears many centuries after the Exodus. Now, this does not automatically disqualify the site, but it does raise questions. How was the location preserved? Who preserved it? And what evidence connects the tradition back to the original event? These questions remain difficult to answer. Another challenge involves archaeology. Despite centuries of investigation, Archaeologists have not uncovered definitive evidence proving that Jebel Musa was the biblical Sinai. No inscription reads, "Moses was here." No monument confirms the event. No artifact conclusively links the mountain to the Exodus. To be fair, the same challenge applies to many proposed Sinai locations. The passage of more than 3,000 years leaves little behind. Still, the absence of direct evidence remains part of the discussion. Supporters respond that we shouldn't expect abundant archaeological remains from a nomadic population. Temporary encampments often leave little trace, and erosion, weather, and human activity can erase evidence over time. The defense argues that absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. A fair point. So where does that leave our investigation? Jebel Musa presents a compelling case rooted primarily in history and in tradition. Its strengths include a continuous identification stretching back over 15 centuries, the testimony of Christian pilgrims, the presence of St. Catherine's Monastery, a substantial camping area at its base, and a location long associated with the Exodus story. And yet, questions remain. Questions regarding the age of the tradition. Questions regarding archaeology. Questions regarding whether the identification originated from preserved memory or later religious interpretation. These questions do not convict the mountain, nor do they exonerate it. They simply become part of the evidence. Evidence that must now be weighed by the jury. Members of the jury, the case for Jebel Musa has now been presented. A mountain backed by centuries of devotion, a mountain revered by pilgrims, a mountain embraced by tradition. But tradition alone does not determine a verdict. The court must now hear testimony from our second suspect, a mountain located not in Egypt, but in Saudi Arabia, a mountain whose supporters claim the traditional identification got it wrong. A mountain that has ignited one of the most controversial debates in biblical archaeology. Its name? Jebel Elaz. And its case will now be heard. The court is adjourned until the next testimony. Case file number 2. Jebel Elaz, the Saudi Arabia theory. Court is now back in session. Members of the jury, our second suspect stands accused of being one of the most important locations in biblical history. Unlike Jebel Musa, this mountain was virtually unknown to the public only a few decades ago. It was not preserved by centuries of Christian pilgrimage. It was not marked by ancient monasteries. It was not featured on traditional maps. Instead, its case emerged from a controversial claim. A claim that would ignite one of the most heated debates in biblical archaeology. The mountain's name is Jebel Elaz, located in northwest Saudi Arabia near the Gulf of Aqaba. To its supporters, this mountain may be the true Mount Sinai. To its critics, it's an example of speculation built upon weak evidence. Today, the court will hear the case. Before we examine the evidence, we must first understand how this mountain entered the conversation.
Yes.
Now, you've been on, I say, Good Morning America, and what are some of the other programs?
CBS Morning News.
Morning News. I mean, a lot of people wanted to hear what happened to you. You and your sons were doing work in Saudi Arabia, right?
Yes, right.
And tell us a little bit about what happened.
Well, we, to investigate a mountain that our research indicated was the real Mount Sinai, where the law was given, the Ten Commandments. And we were proceeding to do this in what we felt was an orderly manner. And we apparently got close to some missiles that were either being transported through the area or set up in the area. At least this is what the State Department said. And when we got ready to exit the country, at customs they arrested us.
Okay, now who arrested you?
The Coast Guard is in charge of customs, and they were the ones that arrested us.
Okay, now when they arrested you, where did they take you?
They took us down to their Coast Guard headquarters, and we met some people there that were quite friendly at first, but we found that they weren't all this friendly. We went through some 3 different periods of interrogation. And the first was by this Coast Guard group. They had a general there that was commanding this, and he interviewed us or interrogated us through an interpreter. And I've never yet been quite convinced that the interpreter told him
What you were
what you
telling
were
us.
saying.
right. Yes. But anyway, after that, then we were interrogated by the General Investigating Office that was in charge of that area. I think their office is in Tobuk. And then after that, they sent some people out from the Monastery. This is the kings from Riyadh, you know, the seat of the government, and had a few questions for us too. And during this time, of course, they kept us separated so we couldn't get our stories together or whatever.
Right. Now, how long were you held?
78 days total.
And what did it feel like? I mean, did you feel like you were going to be in there forever?
Well, there were times when it looked that way, right. In my archaeological research, I always pray about whether I should go, you know, on a trip and if I will be successful before I go. And I asked for a little sign, you know. This is the only way I have of communicating with God. He doesn't speak to me, you know, like he did to Abraham, some of those folks. But anyway, I was assured that, you know, we would find the mountain and that we would get back safely, my sons and I. So when I wasn't being harassed too severely, I could, you know, be at peace with this in mind. But there were a few times you know, when this didn't seem too likely that we would get out.
Now, who got you out? How did you get out?
Well, they didn't tell us a whole lot. We were held incommunicado. They declined allowing us to talk with a representative of our government, which international law requires that they do. And so we were pretty much in the dark. They would, after the preliminary or the main interrogation, periodically they would take one or the other of us up to this head honcho's office and ask us a few more questions. And I think they were getting these questions from their archaeology department. They were seeing if we really were archaeologists or if we were Israeli spies, which is what they accused us of being.
So you were getting ready to leave the country when they stopped you, right? Were you like going, get ready to get on your plane? Going through
Well,
customs or
we had come into Jordan and into Amman and then flown down to Aqaba, and this is about 10 miles from the Saudi Arabian border. So we went through at that point, and we were exiting at that point until this event.
For centuries, most Christians assumed Mount Sinai was somewhere within Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Then, in the 20th century, researchers began asking a simple question. What if Sinai was never in Egypt at all? What if it was in Arabia? Surprisingly, that question does not begin with archaeology. It begins with Scripture. In Galatians 4:25, the Apostle Paul makes a statement that has fueled decades of debate. Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. Paul does not say Sinai in Egypt. He says Sinai in Arabia. At first glance, that statement appears straightforward. Yet, it immediately raises a question. What exactly did Paul mean by Arabia? Today, when we hear the word Arabia, we think of modern Saudi Arabia. But the ancient world was different. The Roman province of Arabia covered different territories than modern political boundaries. Still, supporters of Jebel Musa argue that Paul's statement deserves serious consideration. See, if Sinai is in Arabia, then perhaps investigators have been searching the wrong peninsula all along. Another biblical clue comes from the land of Midian. According to Exodus, after fleeing Egypt, Moses spent 40 years in Midian. He married Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, priest of Midian. While tending Jethro's flocks, Moses encountered the burning bush. Exodus 3 tells us, "And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God." Notice what this means. Moses was caring for the flocks of a Midianite priest when he arrived at God's mountain. The question becomes, where was Midian? Most historians locate Midian in northeastern Arabia, east of the Gulf of Aqaba. If Moses was already living in Midian when he encountered the burning bush, supporters argue that Sinai itself would naturally be located within a near Midianite territory. And where is Jebel Musa located? In the very region traditionally associated with Midian. This becomes one of the foundational pillars of the Saudi Arabia theory. The modern story of Jebel Musa exploded into public awareness through a controversial figure, Wyatt.
Quite an interest in archaeology and also ancient history, which of course has to do with archaeology. So I ran across this statement in the Greek historian's writing, his name's Herodotus, that described how these were built.
In the 1970s and 1980s, explorer Wyatt became convinced that the traditional location of Mount Sinai was incorrect. Wyatt believed the Israelites crossed the Red Sea at the Gulf of Aqaba and entered Arabia. Following this route, he identified Jebel Musa as the true Mount Sinai. His claims attracted enormous attention. Supporters viewed him as a modern explorer uncovering forgotten biblical history. Critics accused him of making extraordinary claims without sufficient evidence. Regardless of one's opinion, Wyatt helped bring Jebel Musa into the spotlight, and it remains there to this day. The court will now examine the physical evidence cited by supporters. Exhibit A, the blackened peak. One of the most striking features of Jebel Musa is its dark summit. The upper portions of the mountain appear blackened when viewed from a distance. Supporters claim this may reflect the biblical description of God's presence descending upon Sinai in fire. Exodus 19 states, Mount Sinai was completely in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. To many visitors, the dark summit appears dramatic and suggestive. Could this be evidence of the mountain having been scorched? Geologists, however, generally explain the coloration as a natural feature of the rock itself. Volcanic and metamorphic processes can produce dark rock formations without requiring natural fire. Thus, the blackened peak remains an intriguing observation. But whether it constitutes evidence remains debated. Exhibit B. The large plains. Supporters argue that this plain aligns remarkably well with the biblical description of Israel gathering before the mountain. Unlike many rugged mountain regions, this area offers extensive open ground. Advocates suggest it could accommodate a large population assembled to receive the law. Again, the evidence is circumstantial. Exhibit C. The Split Rock. One of the most famous sites in the region is a massive rock formation that appears divided down the middle. Some researchers have proposed that this formation may be connected to the biblical account in which Moses struck the rock and water flowed forth. Exodus 17 records, "Strike the rock, and water will come out of it." Visitors point to erosion patterns and channels surrounding the formation as possible evidence of ancient water flow. Critics respond that similar geologic formations occur naturally throughout desert regions. Whether the split rock is connected to Moses remains impossible to verify, but it continues to attract considerable attention. Exhibit D. The altar site. Near the mountain are remains interpreted by some researchers as an ancient altar complex. According to Exodus 24, Moses built an altar at the foot of Sinai. Supporters point to stone structures and archaeological remains in the region as possible candidates. We have shown here the presence of petroglyphs depicting cattle. This is significant because Exodus 32 records Israel constructing the golden calf while Moses was on the mountain. The argument is straightforward. If bovine imagery exists near the mountain, perhaps it reflects memories of that event, a stain from the past, and evidence planted by Israel for future generations to discover. However, critics caution that cattle imagery was common throughout the ancient Near East and cannot automatically be connected to Exodus. The evidence remains disputed. Exhibit E. Boundary markers. Exodus 19 describes Moses setting boundaries around the mountain, and people were forbidden from approaching the holy mountain. Some visitors to Jebel Musa have identified stone arrangements interpreted as ancient boundary markers. Supporters suggest these may correspond to the restrictions described in Exodus. Skeptics argue that providing such a connection is extremely difficult. Ancient stone alignments can arise from many different activities across thousands of years. Still, advocates include them within the broader case. Another argument involves government restrictions. For many years, stories circulated that Saudi authorities fenced portions of the area off and restricted access. Supporters interpreted this as evidence that important discoveries were being concealed. However, alternative explanations do exist. Governments routinely restrict archaeological, military, or culturally sensitive sites. Whether these restrictions indicate hidden evidence remains a matter of speculation. The court therefore notes the claim but does not treat it as proof. Members of the jury, at this point, we must pause and distinguish between two different questions. Question 1. Is Jebel Alaz located in a region consistent with biblical depictions of Midian and Arabia? Question 2. Can we prove that Jebel Alaz is Mount Sinai? These are not the same question. Many scholars acknowledge that the Saudi Arabia theory raises legitimate geographical questions, particularly concerning Midian, and concerning Paul's statement in Galatians. Yet proving a specific mountain remains extraordinarily difficult. And this is where the debate intensifies. Critics of the Jebel Alaz theory raise several objections. First, many of the claims popularized by Ron Wyatt have not been accepted by mainstream archaeologists. Numerous scholars argue that the evidence lacks proper excavation, peer review, and academic verification. Second, no inscription has been discovered identifying Jebel Alaz as Sinai. No artifact explicitly names Moses. No ancient document conclusively links the mountain to the Exodus. Third, several claimed archaeological features remain heavily disputed. Different researchers often reach different conclusions when examining the same evidence. These objections must be considered fairly. The burden of proof remains high. And yet, supporters respond with equal force. They argue that Sinai should be sought where Scripture points, not where tradition later placed it. They contend that Midian's location matters, that Paul's statement matters, that geography matters, and they believe the collective evidence surrounding Jebel Alaz deserves serious investigation rather than dismissal. To them, the case is not built upon a single artifact. It's built upon multiple lines of evidence converging in one location: Arabia, Midian, the mountain, the plain, the altar, the rock, the petroglyphs, the boundaries. Together, they argue the evidence paints a compelling picture. So where does this leave our investigation? Jebel Alaz presents a dramatically different case than Jebel Musa. The Egyptian peninsula relies heavily upon tradition. Arabia relies heavily upon geography and interpretation. One appeals to historical continuity, the other appeals to biblical clues. One has 15 centuries of pilgrimage, the other claims to follow the biblical trail itself. Which approach carries greater weight? That's not for the narrator to decide, though I have my own opinion. The responsibility belongs to the jury. It belongs to you. So, members of the jury, you have now heard testimony from both suspects: the traditional mountain of Egypt and the controversial mountain of Arabia. But our investigation is not complete. We've heard what tradition says, We've heard what archaeology claims, and we've heard what explorers discovered. Now we must hear from the most important witness of all, the Bible itself. The next phase of this investigation will examine every biblical clue regarding Mount Sinai, its geography, its wilderness, its relationship to Midian, its distance from Egypt, its connection to Arabia, and its role in the Exodus narrative. Only then can the evidence be weighed. Only then can a verdict be reached. Court stands adjourned pending final testimony. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we've heard the testimony of tradition. We've examined archaeology. We've even considered history. But now, the court calls its most important witness, the Bible. Because at the end of the day, our goal is not to prove a favorite theory. Our goal is to discover where Scripture itself points us. If Mount Sinai truly was the place where God descended in fire, where Moses received the law, and where Israel entered into covenant with the Lord, then the Bible should leave us clues. Perhaps not a modern GPS coordinate, but enough evidence to narrow the search. Let's examine those clues. Our first clue comes from Midian. According to Exodus chapters 2 and 3, after fleeing Egypt, Moses settled in the land of Midian. There he married Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, priest of Midian. Then Exodus tells us something significant. While tending Jethro's sheep, Moses came to Horeb, the mountain of God. That means the mountain was either located in Midian or close enough that a Midianite shepherd could naturally bring his flocks there. This is one of the strongest geographical clues in the entire Bible. Our second clue comes from the Apostle Paul. Nearly 1,500 years after Moses, Paul wrote these words in Galatians 4. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. Those 4 words, Mount Sinai in Arabia, have sparked centuries of discussion. Did Paul simply mean the broader Arabian wilderness? Or was he pointing to a location east of the Gulf of Aqaba? Whatever his exact meaning, one thing is certain. Paul did not describe Sinai as being in Egypt. Our third clue concerns the journey itself. The Israelites left Egypt, crossed the sea, passed through the wilderness of Shur, Morah, Elim, the wilderness of Sin, Rephidim, and finally arrived at Mount Sinai. Those locations create a travel sequence. The challenge for investigators is finding a mountain that reasonably fits that biblical itinerary. Every proposed location must account for the journey described in Exodus, not just the destination. The fourth clue is surprisingly practical. The Bible describes an entire nation camping before the mountain. Exodus repeatedly refers to Israel assembling at the foot of Sinai. The mountain, therefore, needed enough surrounding terrain to accommodate a massive encampment. Whether one interprets Israel's population literally or more conservatively, the location would require a significant gathering area. Any proposed mountain must explain where the people stood. The fifth clue comes from the mountain itself. Exodus describes thunder, lightning, smoke, fire, a loud trumpet blast, and a mountain trembling violently. The biblical account emphasizes not merely the giving of the law, but the overwhelming majesty of God's presence. While these supernatural events cannot identify a specific mountain today, they remind us that Sinai was no ordinary place. It became holy ground. Another important clue involves Horeb. Throughout Scripture, Mount Sinai is also called Horeb. Many scholars believe the two names refer to the same mountain. Years later, the prophet Elijah traveled to Horeb after fleeing from Queen Jezebel. Any proposed location should also make sense within Elijah's journey recorded in 1 Kings. Finally, there's one more clue. Perhaps the most important of all. The Bible never explicitly identifies the mountain by a modern geographical name. It gives descriptions, travel routes, neighboring regions, historical events, but nowhere does Scripture say, Mount Sinai is this mountain. That omission explains why this debate continues on to this day. If the Bible had named the mountain as clearly as it names Jerusalem or Bethlehem, there would be no mystery, no investigation, and no real trial. And so where does that leave us? The biblical evidence gives us several guideposts. Sinai was associated with Midian. Paul places it in Arabia. It lay along the Israelites' wilderness journey. It had significant space for Israel's encampment. It was also known as Horeb, and it became one of the holiest locations in all of biblical history. These clues do not eliminate every possible location, but they do provide a standard, a measuring stick against which every proposed mountain must be tested. Members of the jury, you have now heard every witness. Tradition has testified. History has testified. Archaeology has testified. And finally, Scripture has given its testimony. The evidence has been presented. The arguments have been heard. The time has come for you, the jury, to render your verdict. The case of the mountain of God is now in your hands. Mount Sinai, the mountain of God on trial, is now in your hands.